You've always been beneath us. Just a poor girl who trapped our son." My mother-in-law, Eleanor, delivered these words with the casual cruelty of someone commenting on bad weather, her diamond-encrusted hands gripping a champagne flute so tightly, I thought it might shatter. Behind her, my father-in-law Robert nodded in agreement, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. They stood in the center of their lavish living room, a room with vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and artwork worth more than my childhood home. Surrounded by 120 of their closest friends and family members, all gathered to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing mid-note. The waitstaff, dressed in impeccable black and white, froze with trays of hors d'oeuvres suspended in midair. Every eye in the room turned to me. I could feel them, pitying, judging, waiting for me to break down or flee in shame. Some guests lowered their gaze, embarrassed to witness such a public humiliation. Others leaned forward slightly, hungry for drama. My husband Thomas stood frozen beside me, his face drained of color, his silence a betrayal more painful than his mother's words. We'd been married for 15 years, and not once, not a single time, had he defended me against his parents' subtle jabs and not-so-subtle reminders that I was an outsider, that I didn't belong. Thomas began, then fell silent, his eyes darting between his mother and me, a man caught between worlds and choosing neither. Eleanor took a deliberate sip of champagne, her perfectly lined lips curling into what some might mistake for a smile. "We've tolerated your background for Thomas's sake. But really, dear, did you think you'd ever truly be one of us?" A few nervous titters rippled through the crowd. My sister-in-law Charlotte, Thomas's younger sister who had always been kinder, stepped forward as if to intervene. But her husband pulled her back with a warning glance. But instead of crumbling, I smiled. "My name is Catherine Mitchell. I'm 45 years old. For 15 years, I'd endured subtle jabs and not-so-subtle reminders that I, the daughter of a school teacher from a small town in Ohio, had somehow hoodwinked their precious son, a Mitchell, into marriage. For 15 years, I'd swallowed my pride, kept my head high, and tried to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect Mitchell. Today, that ended. I stepped forward, my Louboutin heels clicking on the Italian marble floor, shoes I'd bought with my own money, though no one in this room knew that. I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope tied with a red ribbon. "A gift," I said, my voice steady and clear across the suddenly silent room. "For your anniversary." Eleanor's perfect eyebrows arched. "How thoughtful," she said, making no move to accept it. "Open it," I insisted, still smiling. "I think you'll find it quite illuminating." 15 years ago, I'd met Thomas at a charity gala in Chicago. I was there representing the small investment firm where I worked as a junior analyst. He was there because the Mitchells were always there, at every event that mattered in the city's high society. I remember that night vividly, the midnight blue dress I'd saved 3 months to buy, the nervous flutter in my stomach as I entered a world I'd only glimpsed from afar. I was 30, ambitious, and completely out of my element. Thomas was different from his family, warmer, kinder, with a self-deprecating humor that made me forget about his family's wealth. When he approached me at the bar and said, "Help me escape. If one more person mentions their summer home, I might start screaming," I laughed, genuinely and freely. By the end of the night, we'd snuck away to a 24-hour diner where he ate pancakes in his tuxedo and told me stories about growing up with the burden of expectations. "My father mapped out my life before I was born," he said, drizzling syrup over his stack of pancakes. "Mitchell men go to Phillips Exeter, then Princeton, then take their place in the family business. No deviations allowed." I'd told him about growing up in Columbus, where my father taught high school math and my mother worked as a librarian. How they'd saved for years to send me to college. Their only child. Their pride and joy. "They sound wonderful," Thomas had said wistfully. "Real people." When he proposed 6 months later, I thought I was living a fairy tale. The handsome prince had chosen me, not for my pedigree or connections. But for me, that fairy tale turned dark at our engagement dinner. Eleanor had looked me up and down in her dining room, taking in my carefully selected dress, sale rack at Nordstrom, but she didn't need to know that, and said to Thomas, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Darling, are you certain?" She seems ambitious. The way she said ambitious made it sound like a disease. Robert had been more direct. The Mitchells have a certain standard to uphold. I hope she understands what that entails. I'd squeezed Thomas's hand under the table, and he'd squeezed back. But he hadn't spoken up. He'd smiled uncomfortably and changed the subject. That night set the pattern for our marriage, their cruelty, his silence, my endurance. For 10 years, I tried to be the perfect Mitchell wife. I organized charity events, redecorated our home to Eleanor's exacting standards, and swallowed my pride at every family gathering. I read the right books, wore the right clothes, supported the right causes. I remember spending 3 days preparing for a dinner party, careful to follow all of Eleanor's unspoken rules. The table setting had to be immaculate. The menu sophisticated but not pretentious. The guest list carefully balanced. "Catherine," Eleanor said, examining the table settings as I held my breath. "In our circle, we placed the dessert spoon above the plate." She repositioned the spoon with a flick of her wrist. "But I suppose you wouldn't have learned these things another time." At a Mitchell Foundation gala, she'd eyed my dress, a deep red gown I'd fallen in love with, and murmured, "That dress is a bit daring for a Mitchell event, don't you think?" We tend to favor more conservative choices. Each comment was a paper cut, small, but painful, and they accumulated over time. "Why do you let her talk to you that way?" my college friend Melissa asked after witnessing one of these exchanges. We were having coffee the day after a particularly uncomfortable dinner at the Mitchell estate. "It's not worth the fight," I'd replied, stirring my latte. "Besides, Thomas says she doesn't mean anything by it." That was Thomas's constant refrain. Just ignore them, or they don't mean anything by it, or that's just how they are. He never understood that his failure to stand up for me cut deeper than their words. The truth was, I wasn't just a housewife playing at being wealthy. Before meeting Thomas, I'd earned an MBA with honors from Ohio State. I'd had plans, big ones, to start my own investment consulting firm. But I'd set them aside, believing in the promise of our life together, thinking my business acumen would be valued by the Mitchell family with their vast holdings and multiple businesses. Instead, I was relegated to planning parties and managing household staff. "You don't need to work," Thomas would say whenever I brought up my career ambitions. "We have more than enough." What he never understood was that it wasn't about the money. It was about my identity, my worth beyond being Mrs. Thomas Mitchell. One evening, after a particularly brutal dinner at the Mitchell estate, where Eleanor had jokingly asked if my parents had used the proper silverware growing up, I sat in our car and watched Thomas drive us home, his profile illuminated by passing streetlights. "Does it ever bother you?" I asked quietly. "The way they talk to me? They don't mean it the way it sounds," he replied automatically, eyes on the road. Mother's just particular about things. Something inside me broke that night. I realized Thomas would never change. His parents would never accept me, and I would wither away if I continued on this path. The next morning, I made a decision. I would reclaim my dreams, quietly and systematically. Not out of revenge, at least. Not at first, but out of self-preservation. The next day, I withdrew $50,000 from my personal savings, money I'd put aside from my pre-marriage earnings and small inheritances from grandparents. Thomas didn't know about this account. It wasn't a secret exactly, but early in our marriage, I'd realized the importance of having something that was just mine. I found a small office downtown, in a building that had seen better days, but was experiencing a revival as tech startups moved in. The rent was reasonable, the location convenient. I hired a recent business graduate as my assistant, bought secondhand furniture, and opened Meridian Financial Consultants. I chose my clients carefully. women going through divorces or career transitions, people who needed financial guidance but were overlooked by the big firms. I worked while Thomas was at his family's company, telling him I was volunteering or taking classes. It's good for Catherine to have these little projects. I overheard Eleanor tell Thomas one Sunday dinner. Keeps her occupied. I smiled into my wine glass, thinking of the 3 clients I'd signed that week, each bringing assets of over $1 million for me to manage. Within a year, my client list had tripled. Within 2, I'd made back my initial investment 5 times over. I specialized in real estate investments, developing an eye for undervalued properties that could be transformed. I had a particular talent for identifying buildings in transitional neighborhoods that were on the verge of revitalization. Thomas knew I was working, but he didn't know how successful I'd become. He saw it as a cute hobby, something to keep me busy between charity luncheons and social events. It's good you have something to fill your time, he'd say, patting my hand like I was a child showing him a finger painting. As long as it doesn't interfere with our obligations. Our obligations meant the endless round of Mitchell family events, dinners, fundraisers, and social appearances where I was expected to be the perfect, silent ornament on Thomas's arm. Meanwhile, Eleanor and Robert continued their campaign of subtle degradation. At their annual Christmas gala, Eleanor introduced me to her friends as Thomas's wife. She's from, where was it again? Deer? Some small town. I smiled, making direct eye contact with her friend. A steel magnate's wife. Columbus, Ohio, home of 5 Fortune 500 companies and one of the strongest real estate markets in the Midwest. I turned to the woman. Actually, I just helped a client acquire a shopping center there. The returns have been remarkable. Eleanor's eyes had narrowed. Not used to me pushing back, however subtly. She quickly steered the conversation elsewhere. That night, as Thomas and I drove home, he asked, "What was that about a shopping center?" "Just making conversation," I replied lightly. "Your mother's friends always seem interested in real estate." He nodded, accepting this without further question. My husband, I'd realized, saw only what he expected to see, a wife who had accepted her place in his world. What none of them knew was that by then, I was already their landlord. 3 years into building my business, I learned through industry contacts that the company owning the Mitchell's mansion was in financial trouble. Grandeur Properties, a real estate investment firm that specialized in luxury holdings, had overextended, investing in risky ventures abroad, and needed to liquidate assets quickly and quietly to avoid a public relations nightmare. The Mitchell estate, a sprawling 15-acre property with a 10,000 square foot main house, guest house, pool house, and manicured gardens featured in Architectural Digest, was one of those assets. The property was valued at $12, $8 million, but with grandeur desperate for cash and requiring discretion, there was room to negotiate. What struck me as particularly ironic was that the Mitchells had been renting it for 20 years. Despite their enormous wealth, Robert had always maintained that owning real estate was tying up capital unnecessarily. They preferred to invest their money elsewhere rather than tie it up in real estate, a philosophy that had served them well financially, but now presented me with an unexpected opportunity. The Mitchells have been excellent tenants. James Wilson, my contact at Grandeur, told me over coffee. Always pay on time. Maintain the property beautifully. But I know Robert would never buy outright. He's too savvy an investor to lock up that much capital in a primary residence. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. And what's your asking price? Officially? 8. But for the right buyer who can move quickly and quietly, we could go as low as $9 million through a series of shell companies that couldn't be traced back to me, Horizon Investments, Blue Summit Holdings, and finally Lakefront Properties LLC. I purchased the property for $8, $9 million, nearly 30% below market value. I then created a separate management company to handle the lease, ensuring that all communication went through anonymous corporate channels. The transaction was completed in just 3 weeks, with the Mitchells none the wiser. Their lease was transferred to the new owner, and with all the same terms. They continued sending their monthly rent of $25 to what they believed was another faceless corporation. I never planned to use this information as leverage. It was simply a good investment. And perhaps, if I'm being honest, a small comfort knowing that the house they lorded over me wasn't even theirs. The property would appreciate. The rent provided steady income. And someday, perhaps when Thomas and I had children who would inherit our assets, I would reveal this particular holding. But then came the plan for their 40th anniversary party. We want to host it here. Of course, Eleanor had told me over brunch, picking at her smoked salmon while eyeing my choice of whole grain toast with thinly veiled disapproval. Though perhaps you should hire a professional planner. Catherine. These events require a certain touch. Thomas had just nodded, refusing to meet my eyes as his mother effectively told me I wasn't capable of planning her anniversary party in my own home. Or rather, as I privately smiled to myself, my home. Of course. Eleanor, I'd replied smoothly. I want everything to be perfect for your special day. Wonderful, she'd said, patting my hand condescendingly. I knew you'd understand. Now, we'll need the guest rooms prepared for Robert's sister and her husband. They can't stay in the East Wing again. Margaret complained about the morning sun last time. Something in me snapped. After 15 years of enduring their condescension, of watching my husband fail to defend me time and again, I decided it was time to use what I knew, not out of malice, but for something I'd been denied for 15 years, respect. I began planning not just Eleanor's anniversary party, but my own moment of truth. And so we returned to the anniversary party. Eleanor still hadn't taken the envelope from my hands, so I placed it on the glass table between us with a soft but audible thud. The red ribbon gleamed under the chandelier light, a splash of color against the cream envelope. What is this about? Catherine? Thomas asked, finally finding his voice. His tone carried a warning, don't make a scene, don't embarrass us. After 15 years, I knew all his unspoken signals. I turned to address not just him, but the entire room of elegantly dressed guests, who were now witnessing a drama far more interesting than they had anticipated when accepting their gold-embossed invitations. For 15 years, I've stood in this house and been told I wasn't good enough, that I was beneath the Mitchell name. My voice was calm, measured, carrying to every corner of the vast living room. I've been introduced as the girl from Ohio or Thomas's wife, as if I had no identity of my own. Eleanor's perfectly composed face began to show cracks of concern. Robert stepped forward, his commanding presence, the one that had intimidated corporate boards and political figures, now focused on containing me. This is hardly the time for, he began, his voice low and dangerous. I own it, I said simply. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the caterers, who had been moving discreetly along the periphery of the room, froze in place. What nonsense is this? Robert sputtered, his face reddening beneath his year-round tan. I opened the envelope and removed the property deed and management company documents that my assistant had prepared for this moment. Simplified versions that made ownership clear without revealing all my business details. 3 years ago, I purchased this estate through my investment firm. The shell company you've been sending your rent checks to? That's me. I held up the papers so everyone could see the official seals and signatures. Lakefront Properties LLC is owned by Horizon Investments, which is owned by Blue Summit Holdings, which is owned by Meridian Financial Consultants, my company. Eleanor's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. No one moved to clean it up. The sound of breaking crystal seemed to punctuate my revelation. You've been paying me $25 a month for the privilege of looking down on me in my own property. Thomas stared at the documents, then at me. His expression a mixture of shock and something else. Was it respect? Or fear that he'd never really known the woman he'd married? This is absurd, Robert began, but I could see the recognition in his eyes as he looked at the paperwork. He'd seen enough contracts in his life to know these were legitimate. He was already calculating, his brain shifting from social embarrassment to potential financial implications. Check with your bank, I suggested. Call your financial advisor. Speak to the property management company. though they'll simply confirm that ownership changed hands 3 years ago. They'll confirm everything. Eleanor reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. Why would you do this? To humiliate us? Her voice was thin. Brittle. I smiled. Not unkindly. No. Eleanor, it was simply a good investment. The humiliation, that was always your specialty. The room erupted in whispers. I saw shock on some faces, barely concealed amusement on others. The Mitchells had made plenty of enemies with their arrogance over the years, and there was no shortage of people secretly delighted to see them taken down a notch. Patricia Langley, Eleanor's so-called best friend and constant competitor, actually let out a small laugh before covering her mouth with a manicured hand. Her husband, George, who had lost a significant business deal to Robert 5 years ago, was failing to hide his smirk behind his whiskey glass. Did you see Eleanor's face? I heard someone whisper. Worth the price of admission. Thomas finally stepped toward me, his face ashen. All this time, you've been building a business? Making investments like this? He gestured vaguely at the document still in my hand. I nodded. I tried to tell you, many times. But you were never interested in my little hobby. I kept my voice gentle, without accusation. This wasn't about hurting Thomas. It was about finally being seen. Eleanor had recovered enough to find her anger. You deceived us. You plotted behind our backs. Her voice rose shrilly, causing several guests to edge away. I invested wisely, I corrected her. And I never once pretended to be something I wasn't. I never lied about my background or my ambitions. I just stopped apologizing for them. Robert was already on his phone, no doubt confirming what he already knew to be true. His face grew paler with each second of the call. When he hung up, he looked at me differently, not with anger, but with calculation. What do you want? He asked after hanging up, his voice hollow. To evict us? To shame us in front of our friends? I shook my head. I'm not like you, Robert. I don't use power to hurt people. I turned to address the room again, aware that this moment would be retold throughout Chicago's high society for years to come. I wanted to make it count. I came from nothing. It's true. My father taught high school math for 40 years. My mother worked as a librarian. They taught me that wealth isn't what you have, but what you build and who you help along the way. I pulled another document from my envelope. My firm now manages over $300 million in assets. We focus on helping women achieve financial independence, particularly those coming from disadvantaged backgrounds or difficult situations. I paused, looking directly at Eleanor. Women who've been told they're beneath others. A few of the female guests nodded in understanding. One, the wife of a prominent surgeon, actually applauded briefly before her husband touched her arm to stop her. Eleanor remained frozen, her social mask completely shattered for the first time since I'd known her. Robert, ever the businessman, was already reassessing me as a potential ally rather than an enemy. Thomas just looked lost, as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly shifted. You've ruined everything, Eleanor whispered, but her words carried in the silent room. No, I replied gently. I've just changed the dynamic. The party was effectively over. Guests began making discreet exits, murmuring excuses about early morning commitments or babysitters waiting at home. Within 15 minutes, only a few stragglers remained, mostly those too fascinated by the unfolding drama to tear themselves away. Thomas stepped closer to me, his expression unreadable. Did you do all of this because of how they treated you? Because I didn't stand up for you? It was the question I'd been waiting 15 years for him to ask. I met his gaze steadily. I did this because I refused to be less than who I am. And yes, because you never saw what they were doing, or worse, you saw and did nothing. For the first time, I saw real shame in his eyes. And not embarrassment, not discomfort, but genuine shame. I didn't want to rock the boat, he said quietly. I thought if we just went along, they would eventually. Accept me? I finished for him. They were never going to accept me. Thomas, not as an equal. Robert, ever the businessman, was already calculating his next move. We can come to some arrangement? Surely. There's no need for this to become messy. Eleanor glared at him. Arrangement? She tricked us. Robert? She made a smart business decision. He cut her off. Surprising everyone. One I would have made myself. He looked at me with newfound respect. I underestimated you, Catherine. We all did. Yes, I agreed. You did. One of the guests, I believe it was Eleanor's cousin Margaret, who had always been kind to me, started slow clapping. Others joined in, and soon half the room was applauding. Not for the anniversary, but for me. Eleanor looked around, horrified, as her perfectly orchestrated celebration crumbled before her eyes. This is still my home, she hissed, trying to regain control. Actually, I corrected gently, it's my property. You're tenants. Very well-paying tenants, but tenants nonetheless. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen thousands of times when he was stressed. What happens now? He asked, looking between me and his parents. Charlotte, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. I think that's up to Catherine, isn't it? She said, a small smile playing on her lips. She'd suffered under Eleanor's criticisms just as I had, though in different ways. Indeed it is, I replied. The party dispersed quickly after that. Some guests made flimsy excuses, others didn't bother, simply eager to spread the juicy gossip throughout their social circles. Thomas, Robert, Eleanor, and I remained in the now empty living room, surrounded by half-empty glasses and the debris of their shattered social standing. The catering staff had discreetly withdrawn to the kitchen, leaving us in privacy. What happens now? Thomas asked quietly, repeating his earlier question. That depends, I replied. On all of you. Eleanor had moved to the sofa. Looking smaller somehow, the imperious woman who had dominated my life for 15 years suddenly diminished. You'll throw us out? I suppose. Your revenge. I sat across from her. This wasn't about revenge, Eleanor. It was about respect. Something you never thought I deserved? We gave you everything, she said. But the words lacked conviction. You gave me things, I corrected. Houses, cars, jewelry, but not respect. Never that. Robert poured himself a scotch, tossing it back in one practiced motion before pouring another. The lease is for another 5 years, he said, his tone businesslike despite the personal nature of our discussion. Yes, I confirmed. And as long as you continue to pay market rate, you're welcome to stay. He raised an eyebrow. Just like that? Just like that. Business is business, after all. Isn't that what you always say? He nodded slowly, reassessing me with each passing moment. I could almost see the wheels turning, wondering what other investments I'd made, what other surprises I might have in store. Eleanor looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. You must have hated us all these years. I shook my head. I don't hate you, Eleanor. I pitied you. Your world is so small, defined by names and pedigrees. You never saw the potential in people, in me. For the first time in 15 years, I saw something like shame cross her face. Thomas hadn't spoken for several minutes. When he finally did, his voice was thick with emotion. I failed you. I met his gaze steadily. Yes, you did. He flinched at my honesty but nodded in acceptance. I was a coward. You were raised to be one, I said, not unkindly. To never question, never rock the boat. Can we? Can we start over? He asked hesitantly. I considered this. Our marriage had been built on a foundation of inequality and silence. Could it be rebuilt on something stronger? Not over, but perhaps forward, differently. If you're willing to see me, truly see me for who I am. He nodded, and I saw something new in his eyes. Not the blind adoration of our early days, but something deeper. Respect. Robert cleared his throat. Your business, Meridian. I'd be interested in learning more. Even now, he was looking for advantage, for a way to turn this situation to his benefit. But there was also genuine interest there. Perhaps, I said noncommittally. Another time. Eleanor stood abruptly. I think I need to lie down. She looked dazed. A woman whose world had been upended in the span of an hour. As she left, Charlotte returned from seeing the last guests out. Well, she said, looking around at the aftermath of what should have been a celebration, that was not the anniversary party I expected. For the first time that evening, I laughed. It's been 1 year since that anniversary party. Things have changed in ways I never expected. Eleanor and I meet for coffee once a month. Our conversations were stilted at first, both of us treading carefully around years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. But slowly, we're building something that might someday resemble mutual respect. She's even referred 2 clients to my firm, women going through divorces who need financial guidance. You understand what it's like to rebuild, she told me last week, surprising me with her insight. These women need that. Robert has approached me about a potential partnership. My expertise in real estate combined with his connections could be powerful. I'm considering it. On my terms. We've had several business lunches where he's treated me as an equal, something I once would have thought impossible. You remind me of myself when I was younger, he said during our last meeting, except with better ethics. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and I accepted it as such. Thomas and I are in counseling. He's learning to find his voice, not just with his parents, but in all aspects of his life. I'm learning to trust again. We're not the same couple we were, but maybe we're becoming something better. Last month, he stood up to his father during a business meeting, defending his own vision for a new project. I wouldn't have had the courage without you, he told me afterward. You showed me it was possible to break the pattern. I've expanded my firm, hiring 10 new advisors and moving to a sleek office downtown. We specialize in helping women build financial independence, and we've launched a foundation that provides scholarships for girls from disadvantaged backgrounds who want to pursue careers in finance. My parents visited last month, their first time in the mansion. My father walked through the grand rooms, shaking his head in wonder. You've come a long way from that little apartment in Columbus, he said, pride shining in his eyes. Not that far, I told him. Everything that matters. I learned from you and Mom. Last week, we hosted an event at the Mitchell estate. Yes, they still live there. And yes, they still pay me rent. But the dynamic has shifted entirely. It was a fundraiser for our scholarship foundation, and Eleanor worked alongside me to plan it. She even introduced me to her friends as Catherine Mitchell, financial genius and, fortunately for our son, his wife. I don't know what the future holds for us. Relationships built on years of resentment don't heal overnight. But I do know this. I will never again diminish myself to make others comfortable. I will never again hide my light. Sometimes, standing in your power is the greatest revenge. But it's also the beginning of a new story. One where you, not others, hold the pen. What legacy are you building? Are you living by others' definitions? Or creating your own? Share your story in the comments below.